we're experiencing a global crisis, pretty much like what the climate crisis is. And this is a dress rehearsal. What we've witnessed, however, is what should not be done, where rich countries have gone inward, become nationalistic, took care of their technologies, their interests, big pharma in their countries, etc., and did not see this as a time of solidarity, compassion, which is what we are going to need. So the global common good is what we should all be working. And this pandemic taught us very, very heavy lessons.
Greetings, good people. I'm Kumi Naidoo, and you're listening to Power, People and Planet, a series of candid conversations with activists and community leaders from around the world, aiming to tackle the biggest questions of our time. What's race and inequality got to do with climate change? Is our current economic and political system even capable of restoring nature or tackling inequality? And how do we start to rebuild trust, even a new social contract between citizens and people in power? Today, I'm really pleased to be speaking with Tasneem Essop, the Executive Director of Climate Action Network, the planet's largest climate coalition with over 1,300 civil society organizations fighting for climate justice across 120 countries. Born in South Africa, Tasneem started out as a teacher, a trade unionist, and an anti-apartheid activist. After apartheid, she got into politics and actually became the MEC, a provincial cabinet minister in the Western Cape, and did great work around energy, environment, and poverty. And then climate campaigning, served as WWF's head of delegation at multiple COPs, as they called, but was also the person who led the WWF team into the Paris climate talks. And after that, she did some work, which I would really like you to say something about before we run out of time later on, setting up something called the Energy Democracy Initiative. Tasneem, thanks for speaking to us today. Let's start with your personal story. How did you first become an activist?
Well, Kumi, I think our stories would probably be similar ones, living in South Africa. I think there's nothing like watching the home that you live in being demolished by bulldozers to, just make you politically conscious. And so, I was born and grew up in District 6, Kumi. You know that District 6 was one of the largest group areas, act evictions in South Africa. You from Durban, you would know similarly with Cato Manor and other places across the world. Well, I was there, I was young, and watched this, watched our neighborhood go down, watched the people that we lived with and loved being forced out of that place, District 6, and so that sharpened the political consciousness. I was young, as I said. My family has always been politically conscious, so dinner time conversations, was about politics. But when I got to high school, this was in 1976, and as you know, Kumi, 1976 for us, it was a big year. Young students with the Soweto, the big Soweto riots, exactly.
Uprising.
So,
Tasneem, before you go to Soweto, I just wanted to tell those that might not know that the Group Areas Act was one of the worst examples of apartheid government policy. And the story you tell is about the government declaring District 6 a sort of whites-only area and starting to move everybody out. And as you say, in my city, Durban, Cato Manor is the sort of District 6 equivalent of Durban. And it was one of the most brutal things. And today, even when I speak to older people, given some of the tensions that are going on in our country right now as we speak, people talk about how people lived together across racial boundaries and so on before the apartheid state intervened and created a lot of racial conflict in the process. And the anti-apartheid, the Soweto uprising, for me, I was still not quite with it by then. I was that most people in our country in our age range would say that Soweto was
Turning point.
quite an iconic point. So tell us how you remember Soweto.
Yeah, well, let me just go back to the District 6 story and the story of Cato Manor and Sophia Town, etc. As you said, it was the most brutal application of apartheid rules. And the Group Areas Act, of course, made distinctions between these different so-called racial groups, right? Now, District 6, as you rightly said, we lived across those groups. We were a community. People who would celebrate Christmas, even if that was not your religion, we would all celebrate Christmas. If we celebrated Eid,
Exactly, same.
we would all celebrate Eid and Ramadan. It was just such an even though a lot of poverty in the community, it had a sense of community. And essentially, this Group Areas Act and this eviction and displacement broke down the sense of community. And so-called colored people were put into new colored townships like Mitchell's Plain. Devastating. On the Cape Flats, there's no life really. We were told by my grandparents, don't open the door for the white officials because they wanted to know what's your classification, and they were going to put us into a place called Rylands, which was supposed to be for those who were classified Indian. And our parents, we didn't grow up like that, For us, we didn't define ourselves like that. And so just, if you talk through this, and often I find myself pushing this kind of memory back because it does, it's deeply emotional. If you think through the full weight of that experience for many, many thousands and thousands of people. So yes, of course, what we're experiencing today has its roots in those experiences. So let me get on to the issue of Soweto, 1976, the Soweto uprisings, as it was called. I started my high school in 1976, and I went to this kind of, it's in the family, went to the middle class school called Harold Cressy, very reputable school, as you can imagine.
I know Harold Cressy.
And that legacy, the political legacy of Harold Cressy, and all those old veterans of the struggle also as teachers, etc. And bang, here we had the Soweto uprisings in a school. Harold Cressy did not want their students to go out into the streets and go and demonstrate and protest, etc. But we were a little bunch of little rebellious students, and we tried in the confines of the school to, express our solidarity and yeah. So you can imagine your high school career starting off with that. And then it's just no turning back since then. For my political activism, 1976, the turning point, 1980, which was the tail end of my school year. You might remember also then massive uprisings again, students leading those uprisings. I was engaged in what was then called the Committee of 80, where,
80.
The Committee of 80 or 81.
Yeah, I remember that.
81.
81. It was Committee of 81. Committee of 81.
And with all the students from different schools coming, they always sort of wondered why Harold Cressy was there. But we tried to do our bit, Student Representative Council. So yes. And then naturally going from that, at that time, the ANC was banned. It was the UDF, the United Democratic Front, mass-based movement in the country. You, I'm sure, would have been involved as well. And then, you carry on.
I was at the launch of the United Democratic Front in Rocklands, Mitchell's Plain. I was
Oh my God, Kumi, I was there too.
Yeah, it was my first year at university.
Oh my goodness, I was there too. Imagine, I didn't know.
36 hours on the bus to get there.
But what an amazing moment.
Bus broke down.
Oh, of course it would have. I hope you had something to eat. Yeah, in any case, so then got involved in youth, so from student to youth activism. I, in fact, set up a little youth organization in the small little area, which was the remaining part of District 6, actually, that we moved into. And we called it District 6 Youth. Started out as a volleyball club, actually, but that's how you organize. You start off...
Absolutely. Same in Durban.
You know.
That was a way that was a way around
Yeah, yeah.
repression, right? I mean, that's very interesting, actually, and it's worth just pausing to talk about that, because we used to talk about in Durban, we used to talk about first level and second level organizing, and sort of first level organizing was the only kind of organizing that I think that really matters, which is engaging with people at the level of where they were and what they understood, not going in as activists that we knew everything and we're going to preach to you and
Yeah.
all of that. And most of my early activism, Tasneem, you don't know this about me, was actually doing sports. Our youth organization called Helping Hands ran a athletics club, a swimming club, and some of us who were teaching the swimming actually barely could swim ourselves, but that's another story. Uh, but what sport allowed us to do was to get parents would send their kids because it was sports, and then we did lots of education stuff, maths classes and all of that, and one of the things that I'm writing a reflection of early activism years, and one of the things I wrote a couple of weeks ago was how our reality was so different from the reality of kids in most other parts of the world, it's certainly from the developed world, so-called developed world, where, in movies you see kids who will dress up and leave home as if they're going to study at the friend's house, and in the bags they would have their what we would call dancing
Yes.
clothes, clothes that you would put there. For us, this is a true story. For Helping Hands Youth Organization, when we were operating at the grassroots level, especially girls would tell their parents that they're going to a dance, dress up with their dance clothes, right? And in the knapsack have their jeans and
And
tackies.
t-shirts.
And the moment they got into the car, they would change. So we'd go and spray slogans
Yeah.
or whatever
Yeah,
meetings and
yeah,
so on.
yeah. No, that is absolutely true. But Kumi, I must tell you. So, I mean, one day we really have to have another conversation just to explore the similarities and these experiences, because we've moved on, and yeah, we're in a different space for activism. But these were important lessons for me for my activism today, Kumi. Right?
Today, yeah, and reflect on
Absolutely.
that. How much does it shape what you do today and what you've done,
For
say, for
me,
the
it's
last
this
20 years?
point about being on the ground, being organized. So, okay, so I started this little group as a volleyball club, right? Got them, they were playing in the street. We don't have facilities in those days, no club facilities or anything. So I organized it. The courtyard of a wonderful, you must know, community arts project where we did the screen.
Yes, of
Yes,
course.
Cap.
Cap.
At Cap, they
Yeah.
had a
Yeah.
courtyard in that beautiful old church. And of course, the screen printing was happening there, meetings were happening there. They were playing volleyball, these young people, and then slowly did the same thing. You make them aware, etc. And we were operating in that area surrounding Cap, was where I lived then. And that area had people, the community wasn't engaged in the politics, right? But they had problems with rentals, they had problems with services,
Exactly.
so they were community problems. And we would literally be visiting homes of people. We knew every single family in that community. We would be there.
Yeah.
And then when it was time to do these kind of actions, like the candle lights out, if you remember, every Wednesday
Yeah.
night, those people would put out their lights and have their candles in the window. And that was the slow process, but it's slow and important. And we had gangsters in the area. So some of those gangsters joined, not gangsters like we know them today, those kind of petty, some of them were a bit violent.
Yeah.
But they would join our meetings. And then once when we decided we're going to march down that main road where Cap is, big road in that community, and we're going to have a march. And here all these young little people, little youngsters from the gangs also, and the slogan, of course, we sang Viva and Amandla. They're going, horse, you know. But, Kumi, what I'm saying is, you start out from where people are at. Exactly like that. You don't
Yeah.
go there with your, politics and impose it on people. Your politics also has to be informed by the conditions of people. Otherwise it's completely
Absolutely.
disconnected. And that's what I loved about the lessons of that experience for today. I've always been saying, we can do what we want, but you're not going to win such huge, huge struggles without the power of ordinary people. And so that's the big lesson for me. I can tell you many stories, and I hope we do find time sometime to do that.
Yeah.
But yeah, I would say that.
So no, but your experience is pretty unique. I mean, that first part of your experience is completely resonates with mine. But one very major difference, though, is that you moved from being a radical activist and became a senior politician and government minister. I'd like you to sort of reflect a little bit, Tasneem, about what were the challenges working within the system? What did you learn from it?
Okay, so with the first democratic elections, I was on the ANC list to go into the provincial parliament. Um, we were in opposition in the Western Cape. I mean, it was like the most traumatic experience to have come through the struggle, won our freedom, and go into parliament with the people who were responsible for apartheid.
Yeah,
Oh,
we used to feel very sorry for you all. We used to say that Western Cape was the last place on the African continent still ruled by the
yeah, yeah.
white
And the
folks.
white apartheid government folks. So it was a
Yeah,
horror,
yeah,
of
yeah.
course. But then eventually we got into a coalition government with them, actually, because they became closer to the ANC. And in 2004, we won outright. So my first role, actually, as a provincial minister was in the position of transport. What do I know about transport? But my instinct, Kumi, and I think that's the instinct of activists who have come through this kind of grassroots organizing, fundamental principles, and a very deep value system that is guided by the fight for justice, social justice, etc. And recognizing that you knew you needed to use those objectives and use the transport portfolio to address some of those issues, right? So for me, public transport was a priority. Um, Shifting all that big budgets to actually take care of community roads, where many, roads didn't exist in communities, etc. So you have to come with the mindset of transformation in whatever role you are, whether that was as a provincial
Yeah.
minister, whether that's wherever you are, as you know. And then I became the provincial minister for environment. And what did I know about environment? And again, of course, I had to read up on everything because there was no way I was going to get. And in the Western Cape, you can imagine, mainly white civil servants in these departments. And I am here wanting to bring about transformation, but I have a civil service that's actually not aligned with transformation. I had to know my stuff. And in the course of that, my departments briefed me this thing about climate change. I'm like, climate change? What is climate change? This is in 2004, Kumi, when I took over that role. First time I encountered this issue, climate change, to be honest. So I went and read. And at that time, it was the IPCC fourth assessment report. And I read it, not bedtime reading, of course. And I read and the one thing that jumped out at me in all of that scientific report was this point about the need for adaptation, especially in poor communities, because they will be impacted by climate change in this and this and this way. And I realized, oh my goodness, through all of this stuff, that's the point for us, right? Because when I encountered the environmental sector in the Western Cape, very white, very middle class, not making the connections between ecological degradation, poverty, injustice, not at all. It was about biodiversity, conservation. I'm like, my goodness, we are missing the point here. And so that's the way I came into the space, understood climate change as fundamentally an issue of justice. I decided to have a slogan around that so that it became far more connected to the lived reality of people, especially poor working class communities. So
What was the slogan?
climate change is a poverty issue.
Ah, okay.
Simple. Yeah.
Yeah,
That's it.
yeah.
Climate change is a poverty issue. The poor are going to be impacted and are impacted.
What year was that?
2004, 2005.
2004. Because when I take you to the organization you currently work for, CAN, my recollection is, as the new head of Greenpeace in 2009 at Copenhagen, Climate Action Network, when I was saying climate justice, were extremely anxious and opposed to it. So we'll return to it, about how, in fact, international movements did the global cause of climate action a disservice by constantly insisting or resisting the intersectionality of environment and everything else. But let me ask you, do you recommend to activists to consider going into politics, or in the current moment I'm talking about, in the current moment where, basically the social contract between our governments and people is so broken. But I'm not one for abstentionism, but I'd like to just hear you how, like if somebody came to you, and I'm sure there are people who come to you every now and then saying, hey, Tasneem, people have asked me to run for this seat or that seat, and I'm doing good work outside of government. I don't know whether I should go. What do you say to them?
Look, Kumi, I would especially young people, I would encourage them to get into politics, whether that's at the local level, whether that's at the provincial level or national level. Get in. Get in with two objectives. One, to stay true to your goals and your objectives and have your constituency. Please, when you go into this, please make sure that you remain connected to the communities that you're supposed to serve, right? So go in there to make a difference. Secondly, go in there to change the political system. Because the political systems across the world, not just in South Africa, it's broken. It's broken.
Completely.
And how will you fix it? You don't fix it with the people who are there right now because they've adapted to this political system. They have interest in maintaining it. So the status quo can only change if you have new, committed, dedicated, exciting, passionate people go in there. So I will always encourage. But there's one very serious challenge, though. You do need critical mass as well. So you have to build over time a critical mass of people across the world who enter into politics to have a mission collectively to change the system, the political system, right? And there are enough ways that I would suggest we can change that. But let me say, in my...
Wait. No. I'm not going to let you get away with that. That was too tempting. So you say there are many ways in which we can change the system because, your experience in government is a unique one because you went in as an activist, you came out as an activist, right? You know very well, sadly, that the majority of people in our transition from apartheid to democracy went in as activists, but they cannot be in any stretch of their imagination today be described as being true to their values. So what are those things that we can change in government? What are some of the things that you think need to be changed in government? Because that's the real focus of this podcast, really. It's about how do we change the social contract, by which we simply mean the relationship between government and its people. How do we change that? And so what are some of the changes that you would say to a young or older person saying to you, I want to go in, and you say, yes, go in, we need good people to go in. And then you say, but you can't just go in and just operate with the system, you need to change the system. What are some of the changes you would suggest? And it doesn't have to be detailed, you can just give some bullet points.
So look, you will go into an existing system that has its constraints, right? But they
which can swallow you alive.
Yeah. And so the most important thing is you need to know why you want to go in there, right? My role, I always considered to be one in which We have to transform the lives of the majority of black, poor, and working class people, because that was what we fought our liberation for. And so when you go in with very
Absolutely.
strong value system is really important, because people can lose and lose their way, but if you're clear about that and that you're there in the service of people, that should be. Then there are ways inside the system that you can use to bring about those transformations, right? Whether you're a parliamentarian or a councillor, etc., you have power, actually, a form of power. And you have to use that power. Either if you're in an opposition and you don't have that kind of government power, you use it to always consistently highlight what the challenges are for people, what needs to be done, keep the accountability really strong, and keep the connection back to the ground, in that you're always keeping your communities informed. They need to be able to inform you, etc. So that relationship's important. When you do have power, like I had the privilege of having when you were minister, and I considered myself an activist minister, by the way. I was, you're there for transformation. You have immense power, Kumi. Anybody who tells you that you don't have power to change things, they're talking nonsense. You just have to have the political will to do that. I was up against, you can imagine, in the Western Cape, a highly resistant bureaucracy. And they would throw the rule books at you, and you just hold your ground. You, the minister, you can instruct people to do that. Now, that must not be, of course, an abuse of power, but I managed to get through during that time what I consider, and I'm not trying to be immodest, highly progressive things, right? I mean, I was exploring just in the environmental portfolio, this is about regulatory things like EIAs, etc. And they were building these big, rich developments all over the Western Cape, really big developments, gated communities. And I would test putting in conditionalities, for example, that says 19% or whatever percentage of your development must be allocated to social housing. So you test things. Some of them did take me to court. I can't remember if they won or lost. I took on the golf property sector. It was a big thing. I took on that sector and stopped the development of these wall-to-wall golf estates that was going to essentially cut off people from the ocean and, all the things that come with. So there are things that you have the power to do to really help and transform people's lives. So it is, again, let me say, political will, your value system, determination, and just don't take nonsense. If someone says, I can't do that, I prevented all my civil servants from coming into meetings to me saying, oh, Minister, I can't do that. I say, the word can't do that, those words are banned in my meetings. You come and tell me, this is the challenge and this is how we think we can fix it, but don't come and tell. So you go into service to serve, Kumi. So anybody going in now must recognize it's not going to be easy. You would need support systems and therefore the connectedness to your communities, etc., and others, and then go in there with a very clear idea of what it is you are going to do, what you want to achieve, and in the way you conduct yourself, therefore, you already start changing a political system. We talk about democracy and they think elections are about democracy. Democracy comes after the elections as well, right? You have to consistently believe in participatory democracy and constantly be going out, bringing back, and allow for the spaces of engagement by citizens, people, communities, activists, etc. So, look, I would encourage as many people to go into politics now. We need it more than ever. The system, not only the bigger, wide systems, the political system is broken. And yeah, we need some hope, actually.
And I think when you look at many countries around the world where in the pursuit of trying to be pure and clean and untainted and so on, lots of progressive activists stayed out of politics. And in that way, they abandoned the space. And India is a good example to extremely right-wing political tendencies to come there. And in a sense, India, Brazil, the US, Hungary, very other parts of Europe where we've been seeing effectively the rise of fascism is partly because people became disillusioned with politics and stepped away from it. So even though I have to say I also have my reservations still, I think you've made a really good argument, and I'm grateful for that. So let's go back to that slogan, climate change is a poverty issue, right? Just tease that out a bit. What exactly does that mean for you?
So, now we, of course, have further science about this, and so it becomes much more clearer, and the scientists themselves have made the connections much more clearer. You would know in the 1.5 degree report, for example. But, what we are witnessing today, Kumi, when you see the impacts of climate change happening, and these past few weeks have just been a nightmare, right? And of course, we've seen this now also in developed countries. There's, the notion that it's only in developing countries, but there's a differentiated impact. Those who are living in poverty, who's suffering inequality, who are generally marginalized in society, whether a person with disability, whether you're old, you are going to feel the impacts much more than others. That's it, the science says so. And so the poor, and especially in developing countries, are going to bear the brunt of that. Whether that is flooding that takes away your homes. In Cape Town, we have, and it was done in the vulnerability assessment that I had procured when I was a minister, that we would have frequent devastating fires. Where do you think those fires have been most devastating? In informal settlements. The shacks burn down, and thousands of people lose everything, right? So the impacts are going to be felt most by those, as I said, living in poverty. And what brings about the injustice of it all, they are least responsible. In fact, they're really not responsible. What the hell is a poor person consuming compared to us, the rich, etc.? So that is where that fundamental point of injustice happens. And it has always been since the time I was a minister, before I came into, the international NGO space, that was the fundamentals, therefore, to address the climate emergency must be one that also addresses the issues of poverty and inequality and injustice, for sure. Because you can't cherry pick the science, Kumi. You can't cherry pick science. The science said this. Why did we not, as a movement, as a climate movement, pull that out long ago, and make that the clarion call for the work that we do? So, yeah.
Now, you were the head of the WWF's climate team, and I was, when I was at Greenpeace. And on this question, when you reflect of bringing that connection with inequality and poverty, how easy or not was it at the point? And you started roughly around 2009, 2010. So, which is around the time I joined Greenpeace. How difficult did you find that challenge?
I must tell you, I was actually immensely shocked because, I was here in South Africa, right? And our history of activism, as we spoke about earlier, and so much progress in terms of progressive thinking, etc., that we've made. And then I came into the international, what I thought, civil society space, to find out that sometimes our government was more progressive than we were, right? And that they couldn't make the connections, that they couldn't connect the dots. So, for example, that organization, this was around 2008, 2009, were exploring a policy on poverty for the first time. In 2008, 2009, poverty and conservation. And I'm like, I can't believe this. This is something that we all knew about. So it was difficult for me. And I must be honest, coming into the international NGO space at that time, the organizations that I came through, and that included the network that I just headed now, were really very dominated by the global north. Really very dominated. And we had to push and always highlight the fact that this is not representative and we need more, southern, the story, southern voices and blah, blah, blah. And it went on and on and on. So yes, it was challenging, both in the organization I was working for then, and I suppose they probably considered me a radical and out of order, etc. But we make gains, Kumi. So, wherever we start out, that is the objective conditions, but you go about trying to change that. And by the time I left the organization, what were we doing? We had a walkout in Warsaw, things change, and you have to use your role again to just build the consciousness of people. It's not automatic that everybody understands. I realize, understands these things. They also need to go on journeys.
Well, what I want to say is that your experience resonates with my experience at Greenpeace, and I'm going to put a tough question to you now. If on a scale of 0 to 10, 10 being organizations get it and are acting in the way that shows intersectionality and shows connection to grassroots, understands north-south dynamics and all of that. If 10 is an organization is there already, how would you reflect on some of the international NGOs that we've worked for and so on? Where would you place them on that scale of 0 to 10 today? How much more work? Basically, let me be blunt about it. I believe there's much more work to be done by those organizations to get to where they need to be. But on a scale of 0 to 10, where would you place them if 10 is where they need to be?
And now we're talking about those in my network. I do not want to talk about those outside of it, right?
Yeah.
I would say 6.
Yeah.
Just to be fair to those who have moved quite a lot, right? And let me say, and it might be, we might scoff at this, but I think that the rhetoric, at least, has shifted. You would know this too, right? At least now people are articulating these things. Climate change and social justice, diversity, equity, etc. So there's, and the Black Lives Matter movement really shook people up and challenged the environmental movement exactly. And so there's a lot of this happening where people really are starting to talk about this, etc. So I'm giving it a 6 because that's where we are now. We're at the stage of rhetoric, and that has to be translated now into deep transformation, not just performative sloganeering only, or even just, writing up a policy paper, but we have to see that taken through into its deepened form. And I think that CAN has come through a long journey, quite frankly, Kumi. I mean, it's been challenging, and we are in this transition, actually.
Well, one of the things that reflects that journey of CAN is that you are the ED of CAN. I mean, if you don't mind me saying, I remember you were always one of the people pushing CAN from where you were to be all the things that you're trying to do now that you are there. And I really respect the fact that, you can be critical one day of an organization not doing as best as they could, but because the stated mission and vision and so on is good, to go in to help them, which is probably exactly why I went into Greenpeace and help and Amnesty and so on. But actually, it's not quite a light note, but I should tell you, when I was appointed the head of Greenpeace, Van Jones, who's a friend of mine, was appointed as Obama's Green Job Czar. And there was an article that appeared in a US publication, which was entitled, "Why It Is So Hard to Be Black and Green at the Same Time," and how difficult it is to be within the environmental movement. Now, I want to just shift to about, at one level you could say on climate, we've won the argument, right? I mean, if you think about where we were even 10 years ago, today nobody is saying, oh, the science is not clear and so on, I mean, Donald Trump was the last holdout, and hopefully we won't hear too much of him in the future, but that's not guaranteed, of course. So when you look at even corporations today, right? More and more corporations are acting on climate, and investment is starting to flow into things like renewable energy, electric cars, and so on. But how can we push for a similar awakening by these very companies around issues like workers' rights, poverty, access to welfare, and so on? Because let me just take one example, right? If we take electric car growth, which, we would say it's much better than, fossil fuel driven cars. But for the batteries for these cars to be made, for the cell phones we use, for, we have rare earth materials in Democratic Republic of Congo, for example, where it's being mined through massive human rights violations. So you can be sitting in a European country driving an electric vehicle, feeling, oh wow, I'm so politically correct, I'm with the program, but hidden behind doing the right thing on environment is a battery that's loaded with human rights violations, in it. How do you manage that tension?
I think that one of the things, at least, but there's a few I'd like to talk about. One of the things that we have to do is to ensure that the climate movement itself understands this, right? And that when we talk about intersectionality, and we love to talk about intersectionality nowadays, that's actually what this means, right? And so you can't have some kind of so-called victory on the one side and all of these others are still existent. Workers' abuse, human rights abuses, the killing of indigenous people, etc., etc. So you can't. The climate movement, to shift from a rhetoric on intersectionality and climate justice equals social justice sloganeering, would need to be the ones that understand it and therefore shine a light on this all the time. So that's the one piece I want to start with. That's in our control as the movement, right?
Yeah.
The second one would be, of course, we have to insist on the kind of safeguards. And, we safeguards here and decide on safeguards there, but safeguards are important. And again, who's at the table making all these decisions are also important. So, everybody's busy now with the just transition, for example. It's become as sexy as sustainable development was in those days, right?
Was.
And
Yeah.
everybody has their own understanding of a just transition. But the fundamental thing about this is the just part. And this, Kumi, I am very passionate because I led some of the just transition work in South Africa as a commissioner. It is about the justice of a process itself. So who's actually in the process? Who's sitting at those tables? Who's deciding on the vision for the future and how we get there? Has to ensure that it's inclusive. All those voices need to be there. If you're deciding on what technology choices are being made, that cannot be made in boardrooms of governments and corporates. We need to have an inclusive process around those decisions, those trade-offs as well. People, all of them, the social partners, if I want to call it that, must be in that conversation and contributing. And then we have to ensure through that the outcomes are just as well, right? And all of these things must be explicit and deliberative. Can't be, are we having a just transition? Someone declares it's a just transition, decided to draft a plan in a room somewhere, or some consultant did something. It's not that at all. Otherwise, we will end up exactly with this. We've sorted out the technological intervention to ensure we brought down a few emissions, but bugger the lives of, who that impacted on. So yeah, it has to be deliberative. We as a climate movement must lead and ensure that there's a light shone on all of these things, that there's policies that's implemented around this. But yeah, you're absolutely right, this is it. This is the big challenge, that some parts of the world, this is about the things that they can do now. When people talk about electric vehicles, it's really awesome. Then I'm thinking about where I'm sitting, and which poor community here, let alone, they don't even have a house, let alone a street that is tarred for a car to drive on, So the solutions to the climate emergency have to be appropriate for the context also, right? And the old debates about, but we need development first and we can't think about these, this is going to be a problem for our development, is nonsense as well. Let's be very honest about that, because that's why I kept on with this climate change is a poverty issue. Because the one way you address resilience is by addressing poverty and inequality, for example. So solutions are going to have to be truly intersectional, take into account the context in which we work, and, not have a kind of big technological focus somewhere and think that's going to be possible all over.
Thank you for that, Tasneem. Can I take you to Paris, right, to the climate negotiations? Can you give me a sense, I was there, as you know, with you. How did you feel when we got to the end, and were you satisfied with what was agreed?
So to be quite honest, Kumi, and of course now we reflect a lot, right? So I had a mixed feeling about it. On the one hand, after years and years and years of, trying to get an agreement, we got one. So that in itself was very important and very powerful. Countries across the world, well, then of course the US stepped out, but, came together and finally agreed on something. My other strong feeling was, of course, that it was not what we required, because building an architecture, a climate architecture that is fundamentally about volunteering action is deeply, we can see it today, right? Everybody said we're going to, have these nationally determined contribution. That means that every country can decide what they're going to contribute. And nobody's going to, there's no enforcement mechanisms. There's a compliance mechanism, but there's no real enforcement mechanism because it's not legally binding, your little nationally determined contribution. And so that was a bit of a problem for me because I knew down the road we are going to experience exactly what we're experiencing today. Countries who have not submitted their national contributions, countries who are not willing to enhance their national contributions, countries who don't understand what their fair share contribution must be. So everybody does their own thing, but in the global, if you look at the remaining global space, which has largely been already, eaten up by the rich countries, there's some left. Who's going to have the right to that remaining global carbon space? Who? And so all these little things that countries are contributing to doesn't even factor in the issue of equity and fairness. So yeah, I was disappointed about the voluntary nature of the regime, the climate regime we built up in Paris.
Especially since in 2009, I'm talking about Copenhagen now, 6 years earlier, where we were trying to get what we got in Paris. By the way, we just remind ourselves that we got it like 6 years later, or 5 years later. And what we were talking about then was what we said, we need a FAB deal, a fair, ambitious, and binding. And the B, I and others have said what we got in Copenhagen was a flab deal, full of loopholes and bullshit, right? So now, and my sense is similar to yours, but I think why it was important that we claimed Paris as a achievement of activism, because you and I were part of these conversations. Remember, like, whenever people said the road to Paris, we said no, we want to call it the road through Paris, right? Because Paris is not the end point, and it's never going to be. And one of the important things that people should know is that one of the most important things we fought for in Paris was the review mechanism. That every 5 years we would review what the science is saying in terms of the IPCC assessments, and we would adjust the commitments upwards as is the case. Now, I just want to say something that might not be exactly popular, to say that I actually think right now, if we are brutally honest with ourselves, we don't have any more carbon space, right? I think we are far too close to the climate cliff. And so right now, I think, and I had a chance to say this to President Ramaphosa at a meeting 3 years ago, where I said, if you continue to drag your feet and don't get as far ahead of the green technology curve now, people in the so-called developing countries or the global south will be in the same situation that we are in now, that we'll be slaves of technology and patents and so on that are all registered. And I pointed it out to him that Stellenbosch University, I don't know the details of it, but I understand that they've actually designed one of the more powerful solar sort of panels, which is not a flat one, which can, and so on. And I said, we need to be investing there, get ahead of the curve and so on, because the successful countries and companies of the future are those that are going to be as far ahead of the green technology curve as possible. Unfortunately, my sense is that even though you can get intellectual acceptance of the argument, it does not translate into action. But let me pose the difficult question. Do you think the Paris Agreement will survive the Trump years and the COVID recession? It has to, but but do you see it being taking a beating?
No. Actually, that is the interesting thing. And that is why when we're reflecting about it, and we can, of course, we have to we have to interrogate what we achieved there. But the interesting thing about it is that actually the Paris Agreement has, in a way, kept galvanizing, right? Galvanizing governments, galvanizing corporates, etc. Not, of course, doing what is needed in terms of ambition levels, but it keeps that kind of galvanization or momentum around it, right? So interestingly enough, I don't think it is. And just to add, I don't think exactly because of COVID. Exactly because of COVID. Because here, as I said to someone else or somewhere else, COVID, this is like in our, now, we're experiencing a global crisis, pretty much like what the climate crisis is. And this is a dress rehearsal for what we do in the climate. And exactly this issue, Kumi, what we've witnessed, however, is what should not be done, where rich countries have gone inward, become nationalistic, took care of their technologies, their interests, big pharma in their countries, etc., and did not see this as a time of solidarity, compassion, which is what we are going to need. Where the interest of the public good trumps that, sorry to use the word Trump, but trumps that of the private interest. So the global common good is what we should all be working. And this pandemic taught us very, very heavy lessons. So I think it's also...
But it looks like the leaders of rich countries, it doesn't look like the leaders of the dominant rich countries of the world learned that lesson, because the way they dealt with the vaccines, I mean, I wrote an opinion piece some months ago for the Sunday newspapers here in South Africa, where I said hoarding of vaccines is a crime against humanity. And I think, but apart from what it does to us in the South, it's not in the interests of governments in the rich, because this failing to recognize that certain things do not respect national boundaries, you would have thought this was something that is so obvious. And I was just speaking today to some friends in UK and France, and they were saying if they look at what's going on in France now, where there's like the start of the fifth wave, I believe, I forget now, fourth or fifth wave, and then the UK government, for political reasons, declared Freedom Day when the scientists were saying, calm it down, and now people are scared that the UK is going to be what they call a variant factory, continue to generate new variants, and so which maybe the current crop of vaccines will not be able to assist. But let me ask you to reflect on, given all of this sort of negative news, the lives that have been lost from COVID and the conflicts that have arose and so on, I want to share with you a perspective and see how it sits with you, right? On the one hand, almost everybody I speak to says, shoo, especially people like you who've been around for a long time fighting the good fight for justice. They say, I don't remember such a depressing moment where so many things are falling apart in terms of, and the pandemic in particular. And then they say in the same breath, however, from all my years of activism, I cannot remember any period in my life where I feel so optimistic about substantive structural and systemic change that, in fact, maybe this is the moment, maybe we needed this horrible pandemic to shock us into reality and to give us the strength and courage to make the big changes that we need, including redefining the social contract between people and governments. Does that resonate with you?
Yeah, it should resonate with you, Kumi, because if you think about it, right? Our experience in South Africa, we never thought we're going to win our freedom in South Africa. How many times did we say, a young person, we'll never see our flag being raised.
We'll never see Mandela out of prison.
We wouldn't see Mandela out of prison. So we never know where on this arc of change We are, right? That kind of something might happen that just, the pandemic could have contributed. That might not be the one. It might be another one. I'll tell you what gives me optimism, and it should give you as well, because in the midst of these devastating times like we had under apartheid, what was flourishing? The people, the power of people. That was flourishing. And if you see this, you'll see across the world, people are tired, they're sick and tired, and they're taking, action in whatever way they are doing that, right? There's been a surge in movements across the world, whether it's the youth movement, the movement, indigenous people standing firm against pipelines, and across Africa, young people standing up, etc. And that is what gives me optimism. Because, okay, we might not have big, massive structural change tomorrow or in our lifetime, but the movements are growing. My children call me a boomer, Kumi. I don't know about you, but so they tell me, watch out for Gen Z. Now I'm like thinking, okay, Gen Z, that's the thing. I want to remain optimistic exactly because we've learned throughout history that change comes through the power of people.
People, absolutely. So my last question then, in the context of keeping optimistic and positive, assuming I could wave a wand and offer you the power to write one clause in every constitution in every country that guarantees a more just, sustainable, and meaningful social contract. Do you have something that you would prioritize above other things from your long years of dedicated activism?
Kumi, I mean, okay. I don't want to.
Your problem is similar to mine because you got too many things that you want to get in there. So I know if somebody asked me, I would struggle. So, but if you were pushed to take one,
I would say the principle of nothing about us without us. Enshrine it as a principle in that social contract.
That's fantastic. Just say a little more about that, though.
I think this principle emerged, out of the Shack Dwellers organization.
International Shack Dwellers movement.
Yeah. The International Shack Dwellers. And the first time I heard it, it just struck me. Like, my God, that's exactly it. So it is this point I made earlier about, all these decisions that are going to have to be made in the context of what has to be radical transformation of our societies and our economies, etc., cannot be decided on without those, as I said, who are most impacted, those who are living in poverty, those suffering from inequality. The very justice of it all requires that those decisions are made with those people. So about your life, if it's going to be a decision about it's going to impact your life, you have to be part of that decision making. That's it. Simple.
Tasneem Essop, Executive Director of Climate Action Network, thank you so much for your time, so much for your energy, and for all that you do. Good luck, Tasneem. Hope that all your visions and dreams and the work that you're doing bears fruit, because the world needs it to bear fruit. Thank you so much for making time to speak to Power, People and Planet.
Thanks, Kumi. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Power, People and Planet. The show is produced in association with the Green Economy Coalition, one of the world's biggest global alliances fighting for green and fair economies. We would love your help to spread the message of this podcast and the conversations within, so please do follow us and leave a review wherever you get your podcasts. See you next time.